Welcome to Artsplanations, the podcast that is for non-artists, artists, and everyone in between.
Each week, we ask a different search engine a question related to art, and then we talk about it. Hello, and welcome back. I am Andrew Malcheski.
And I'm Joanna Bolsons.
And today, we are going to be talking about folk art. What is folk art? And if you were to use a search engine like AOL, the answer you would get is that folk art is art produced by artisans trained in a relevant skill working within a local client economy. I think a better answer to that is what Wikipedia provides, and that is that folk art covers all forms of visual art made in the context of folk culture. Definitions vary, but the objects have practical utility of some kind rather than being exclusively decorative. The makers of folk art are typically trained within a popular tradition rather than the fine arts tradition of the culture.
It's kind of strange that Wikipedia has a better definition.
Yeah, a little bit. I don't think either one of those really encompasses what folk art is, as like the American Museum of Folk Art contextualizes it, you know?
Yeah, I think at its basis, folk art is just untrained art. It's like art brut. It's just they haven't gone to university or weren't formally trained as we would define it today.
Yeah, I would go even further and say that it's someone who didn't seek out those formal elements of design in order that you're taught in school. You know, generally it's someone who's learned either in an oral tradition or some other tradition where they're given the knowledge of how to do a specific thing, and they can execute that one thing well, but not the information or knowledge on how to develop an idea or concept into a visual image.
So like the training on how to make something like let's say a quilt or something, it's passed down, it's trained for the structure itself, but to expand it and push the medium forward, that part of the learning is no longer there, or it was never there to begin with, I should say.
Right, it's not something that is actively taught along with that knowledge of the technique. Folk artists, they don't sit down and think, oh, okay, I'm going to have a family scene, and so the line should move this way to move the eye around the composition, and the color should play off this to highlight this context of what this means, and this aspect will mean this. That's not really a way that a folk artist approaches things. Instead, it's like, I want to do a family composition, so I'm going to do a family composition, and they just do it. They make it on whatever medium they're making out of without thinking about how they're contextualizing it through the formal elements.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Well, who do you think of whenever you think of folk art?
I guess like Grandma Moses is honestly the only one that really comes to mind. There's some other folk artists, but for the most part, I'm not interested in folk art. It doesn't... Or I should say, I'm not interested in those people who have garnered enough fame as folk artists, and I just did air quotes there, to be, you know, in galleries and recognized by the institution as these like amazing folk artists. Their work just doesn't, I don't care. I like the work of like craftspeople and people who are making things who aren't trained in a traditional way, you know, woodworkers.
So when you say that you don't like the folk artists that have been kind of highlighted as great folk artists, is it you don't like their work specifically, or you just don't like the exploitation aspect of a gallery making millions off of somebody who's untrained and might not know better?
I don't like their work.
Okay.
One, it's because it's being put into the institutional space of the fine artist by the fact that it's now in a gallery. And if it's being put in that space, then it should be by a trained artist. Like, that's the whole point. It's an institutional space. And so to take this work from someone who has, you know, is doing this as a hobby or fun and has no training, and then to try to elevate it, I don't understand why. Like, besides a monetary gain.
I can agree to that to a certain level, but if it was like a local gallery, I would be okay with it, because to me, that's the point of folk art, is it's your local artisans.
Right, and that's not what I'm talking about at all. What I'm talking about is like
You're talking about like the Met.
Yeah, I'm talking about those folk artists, once again air quotes, who have been elevated from a hobbyist or a person following a tradition, and now they have gallery representation. They're being propped up as some kind of, exemplar of the formal art tradition, as like this idiot savant almost. Like, they have no training, and look how amazing their stuff is. I don't really think it's that amazing to begin with.
Yeah.
And then the fact that it's now being presented as somehow as desirable or more desirable than
it's good marketing.
Executed stuff. Right. I'm not a fan of, in general, I'm not a fan of any artwork where the marketing is better than the work of art. Mm-hmm. Which is why I generally don't like abstract expressionism, because it tends to be that the marketing is better than the work.
I mean, there's some, I honestly like Grandma Moses. I like Maud Lewis. Do I think it should be hung up next to, a piece in the Louvre? No. But I think for what it is, I can enjoy it. And I think that's the difference, is I know what it is. I know what I'm getting. I'm not going to pay $3 million for a Maud Lewis if I could then get a Kusama,
Right. Well, I mean, the thing is, why would I want to look at a Grandma Moses when I can look at a Whistler? They're both scenes of life.
Yeah.
Of like that kind of stuff. I can look at one of the Dutch masters, still lifes. And why am I going to pay attention to Grandma Moses? Yeah, it's a slice of Americana life from that one person's point of view. That isn't really that great of a reason for it to be elevated so high, except for the marketing surrounding that one person and how she was used to kind of, I don't want to say used, it's not the right word, because I don't really think that she was exploited per se.
Well, she might have been. I don't know enough about her history, but...
Which is the other thing. I don't know enough about folk artists, because I'm not interested in them to say whether they're exploited or not, but I know that when I see their stuff, it's like anything I see in a museum that I don't like, I just kind of shrug my shoulders and go, meh.
Yeah.
And I'm not interested.
I would rather that happen. I would rather have somebody like an untrained artist getting picked up by a gallery, and then they're, I'll use the word exploited loosely here because we don't know for sure. I'd rather see that, though, than somebody who is formally trained, who went to years of school, who then disregards all of those rules and those teachings to say, oh no, I'm a folk artist.
Right.
Like, why did you waste all your money then going to school to just...
Yeah, or they don't call themselves a folk artist, say, oh, I'm an outsider, or I'm practicing a primitive style. And it's like, but you're
not.
Like, as soon as you decided to go get a formal education in the arts, you lost that ability to honestly say that you're an outsider or primitive or any of those things. You are a formally trained person now.
I honestly think like the term primitive art should not be used today with the age of the internet. You cannot be primitive no matter where you are or how you start. I think primitive should only be applied to art history at this point, where it was primitive man. It was before the industrial age.
Well, the same way, I don't think folk art should be applied to any painting, especially in any kind of Western civilization, because there's, like, anybody can go online and see a 5-minute YouTube clip that will inform them of everything they need to know. Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing, is like, folk art as an art from a tradition of a culture done in a medium specific to that locale, I don't think Grandma Moses qualifies. She was doing paintings. Like, the tradition that she has isn't in painting. Like, painting is not an art form that comes from a folk tradition. It is an art form that comes from
a fine art tradition.
And mainly, if you can do paintings, it's because you are, if not trained in doing it, then you are wealthy enough to afford the time and the resources to do it.
That's a good point. I didn't think about that.
Some of the other folk artists, like, there's a African-American woman who was in the same vein as Grandma Moses, but she started painting because she was a made for a wealthy white family, and they had like little painting clubs, and there was leftover paints that she was able to get from them. And so because they had basically leftovers for her to use, that's how she was able to get the supplies to then create paintings. And it's like, okay, that's kind of a little bit closer to what I would consider a folk art, someone using a medium they're not trained in, they have no knowledge in.
They're getting the scraps of.
Kind of getting the scraps and using what's available to produce something. But still, painting, like, they don't have a tradition that they're coming from where they're being passed down these oral, like, histories and lessons that are learned. And
it's not like a sea village where they're making their knickknacks and stuff out of shells, or something.
Or if you look at, when we were in Guatemala, those weavers who that mother showed us her daughter's work, and like she passed down the patterns of their weaving. Same thing with the villages; they have colors for their villages that are passed down from generation to generation.
On that same vein, Scotland, the tartans that they wear, they're all specific to their clan.
Right. And
but even then, you can make the argument that those are a type of textile which has art historical value. So is that then folk, or is that just cultural?
If you're taking your knowledge of making tartan, right, and you're using that tradition that you were taught, and then you apply that in some other manner, then it would become a folk art. That's what I'm saying. Like, if you're taking that thing that you are taught to do as a tradition, as like, quilting, weaving, pottery, depending on the potter.
Yeah. Well, we just talked about George Orr.
Right.
Like, was he formally trained? Yes. He was?
Yeah, and pottery is one of those things where it's hard to make. You can make the argument for both ways, because one, you can be an incredibly highly educated person who is doing pottery. We talked about how you have to have so much knowledge to do the glaze chemistry. You can also be taught that in a folk tradition where you were just taught you pour powder A, powder B together, mix with water, and you get glaze A.
Yeah.
And you don't fully understand what's going on, but you know the recipes to mix the stuff up. And because you were taught, this is how you make cup. You make 600 cup a day, puts food on the table.
Yeah.
When you take those and then you branch out and you're like, well, I'm going to make cup with 6 handles now. That's when you start to become a folk artist. And that's what I'm saying, like, with painting,
that's when you start to become a folk artist or a fine artist?
Folk artist. Because you haven't applied,
you
haven't learned the fine art traditions yet. You've just taken your knowledge of the craft and the medium that you learned, and you're now trying to think beyond that industry into, how do I make this my own? How do I tell a story?
That's what I was about to say. So before they start pushing the boundaries of what they've already been taught and those basics that they've been taught, they are just part of a manufacturing industry. They're part of a job.
A craft tradition.
Okay. I was just trying to see how you would split the different, how you would differentiate.
And that's a good thing to point out too, is like, we're splitting hairs here. I think that all of those people in that craft tradition, they are artists. They are artisans. And they are producing work that takes great skill and great knowledge to do. And that is, like, and as we said, there's artistry in doing that. But where they start to break into the realm of the fine arts,
it's about intent.
It's about intent, and also about the ability to add concept to what you're doing, add a deeper meaning and a deeper idea to something, whether that's this cup represents the vessel of life, and these vessels have, mean this beyond that, or this cup represents my country because I'm using glazes that are the national flag.
Or clay that's specific to a mud bank in this region or something.
And it's when you start to think about those aspects of something that you're making, that's where you start to move into the realm of the fine arts. Whereas the craftsperson, he might use all those same things, but he's doing it because it's what he can get. It's what sells.
It's what he knows.
It's what he knows.
Well, and again, splitting hairs, like just talking about the intent behind the work and the contextualization. I mean, as much as you might hate abstract expressionism, that's what that is. They know how to talk about the work. So what if that craftsman is beginning to elevate himself to the fine artist tradition, but his work just isn't up to par because he isn't trained? is that still museum worthy at that point?
I mean,
in your opinion,
it depends on the work.
Well, that's what I just said. His work isn't quite up to par yet.
Then,
like it's a little janky.
And if his concepts are good, he's got these amazing ideas, but his work is janky, and his work is janky.
That's all that matters.
It's not all that matters, but it does play part in how I view work and my appreciation for it. Mm-hmm. And I don't hate abstract expressionism. I like some abstract expressionists. I like some work that is...
You like the color fields.
I like the color fields. I like Frank Stella.
Yeah. Well, hate was the wrong word. I take that back. But you definitely don't lean towards that in any respect.
And that's because the majority of the abstract expressionism that I see, most of it is regurgitating the same conceptual basis of everything else I've seen. It's just not as good as the best. And so when it's not as good as the best and you're still relying on these same kind of like, well, it's an expression of love and freedom. And it's like, okay, but
everything's an expression of that if you say it is.
Right? It's like, oh, this represents my hate for money, so I tore up $1,000 bills. It's like, okay, but that's not that great of an expression of it. Like, and if it's not done incredibly well, especially with abstract expressionism, if it's not super clean and super good, and there's not something about it that is just like, oh, okay, I get it. Like, whoa, like has one of those kind of feelings to it. I've seen it before, and that's part of it's because we live in a digital age where you can see everybody try it, and because it's so easy to make something that is non-representational. Because everything can be non-representational if you just throw some stuff at it.
Well, to rein this back in, away from abstract expressionism, bringing up the digital age is a good point. It's like we said before, like, there's no way you can call yourself a primitive artist because we live in the digital age. There's no way there are any folk artists anymore. We have Etsy, we have the farmer's market, you've got Instagram, you have all these resources that you can make your home goods sellable. I mean, how many different acrylic pour artists do you see where they do those abstract canvases, or how many resin pieces do people make? Like, you don't have to be trained in anything. You can look it up at the library, you can look it up online, and you're set.
Yeah. And like I said, if you want to be formally trained in the arts, you don't have to go to school anymore. You can just find a YouTube video. You can go to the library and get a book that will give you all the information you need. In fact, looking at our bookshelf, I can see 3 books that have that stuff in it. The information is there. All you have to do is take it. And so if you're making art and you're not doing it, it's because you are intentionally not pursuing those kind of ideas and like the formal things that make fine art. In which case, why not? One, you're aware enough of what you're doing that you're not doing something, which means that you're probably not doing it well because you're not being inspired by...
I'm a little lost. What are you talking about?
So I'm saying that in today's society, if someone hasn't looked up like the fundamentals of how to make something, like when you draw lines like this. This is chiaroscuro. This is light and shadow.
Well, you started talking about like if you're not exploring that or not pushing forward,
that's what I'm saying.
Not?
If you haven't looked those up as an artist and exposed yourself to them, it's because you have made a deliberate choice to not do it. And in which case, why aren't you?
Yeah.
And it probably is because you want to be able to say, I'm an outsider artist. I'm raw. I don't need formal training. And it's like,
there's no outsider art anymore. There are so many niche areas of the internet where you can, how the hell did furries become a thing? The internet has brought them together.
Right.
Which, I'm not knocking furries, but that's a very specific thing.
Yeah.
And if we didn't have the internet, I wouldn't know they'd exist.
I would, because my first roommate in Chicago worked as a seamstress who made a lot of custom costumes.
But would she have gotten that work without the internet?
Oh, probably not. Well, actually, they did go to a lot of conventions to advertise.
But how did conventions get started?
They had conventions before the internet.
But were they as big and as abundant?
Yeah, in like Vegas and Reno.
Vegas and Reno, 2 places, but
which
now
everybody
they're
knew
global.
that's where the conventions were.
I'm just saying it wouldn't be as prevalent, it wouldn't be as widespread.
Right, but there were mailing lists and small pulp magazines. There's still ways that information got out.
Ways, but it would have been very, very small. I mean, look at Betty Page. Like, BDSM is a thing, but, like, it was very underground. And she wasn't even popular until after all of that. We're getting way off topic. So...
Let's circle back to the actual question, though. What is folk art? What do you think of when you think of folk art?
I think of quilting. I think of quilting and Grandma Moses.
Do you know of any other folk artists who aren't Grandma Moses?
I know the guy that does the blue dog paintings.
Oh yeah, I don't know what his name is.
I don't know either. Yeah, that's really it. Because it wasn't my thing. And I know... very small town in Texas, and other than like the ladies at church who had their quilting bee, there was a small Western gallery with a bunch of Western paintings, but 2 of the artists I know made good money. Like, they weren't folk by any mean, and they were formally trained. One of them I think went to UT.
Yeah.
So, really, the only folk artists I saw were, like, the grandmas that would paint because they were retired.
Yeah.
Or the grandpas that, like, did woodworking.
Yeah, or most folk stuff that I would say that I saw would be, like, people who did, like, muffler sculptures in front of their muffler shop, or...
Oh, yeah.
You know, that's what I think of when I think of folk art. Stuff that is that kind of like kitschy, I want a muffler guy in front of my muffler shop. Not things like the cigar Indians, which were made by professional craftsmen.
Well, I think there could be an argument on craftsman versus folk art. I think folk art is more of a hobby. Whereas craftsmen, they're looking to refine what they are working on and produce, possibly for a living. I think there's an argument there for a difference between the 2.
I think to be a good artist, you also have to be a good craftsman.
Well, I'm not arguing that, but I think the difference between folk art and craftsman, folk art is, again, untrained, and it's more of a hobby.
Yeah, because all the craftsmen I know are skilled, highly trained.
All the craftsmen I know, I immediately think of woodworking. And you have to be skilled, otherwise you can sleeve a finger, or worse.
Yeah, put a gouge through your hand.
Yeah.
I think just woodworkers, but fabricators, welders, if you're good at those things, chances are you've gotten some schooling somewhere that taught you how to do that right. Because if you don't do it right, your things break.
Yeah.
And most of the people who are metal fabricators or professional welders, if they take up art later, it's after they've already done it as a job. Like, that was what they made. They took it up because that's how they made their money. Or one of their relatives does that, and that's how they got access to the equipment.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, being taught in that oral tradition from someone, here's how you do this thing. You don't need to understand the science behind it. You don't need to understand all this stuff. This is how you do it, so you can just make your art thing.
What I also enjoy about folk art is typically the community aspect that I think of, because they would have quilting bees, or they would have painting parties where the women would get together and do watercolors. Things like that. I don't know about woodworkers, those kinds of craftsmen. I'm sure they would get together and like whittle or something, but I've always enjoyed hearing the community aspect. Weavers would get together and like set up their looms and just talk and converse. I like the gathering aspect and having a communal space to just create together.
Well, in that sense, would you consider something like Tipsy Canvas a folk art community?
No, because again, folk art, I think, is non-existent in the digital age. I think it's a pastime.
As in, its time has passed and it can't be found anymore?
No, I think it's a pastime for people because if you're a folk artist, let's say folk artists still exist, which I don't believe they do. They're doing it on their own time. They're trying to find their own materials and set up their own stuff. They might set up their own paint nights, but something like Tipsy Canvas, that's something that somebody might go to once a year or once in a lifetime. It's an experience, and it's at most a pastime for, a girls' night or a date night.
Okay. Well, then if you YouTube like folk artists and you try to find folk artists online, you'll see a lot of these like Appalachian Johnny up in his cabin, paints on, washers. Mm-hmm. What about those kind of people? Like, they are clearly being filmed as folk artists and identify themselves as folk artists. Would you consider them? And this is kind of what comes back to what I was talking about before. Like, if they call themselves folk artists and they say, well, I'm a folk artist because I was never trained, it's because they are actively trying to not be trained.
They're willingly not progressing.
Right. They're trying to stick within this concept, whatever they think it is, obviously because they're hoping that they can sell what they're doing.
Well, to play devil's advocate, what's wrong with that?
Nothing. I don't think anything's wrong with it, but that changes what a folk artist is.
Well, that's why I'm making the argument they don't exist anymore.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I agree with you. Because I don't think that those people are folk artists. I think they're just...
I think they're trying to make a quick buck.
Yeah, I think that's... And once again, I don't know this. I have no proof of this. But my feeling on the subject is, when I see that, it's that they are working hand in hand with a gallery to make money. And there's nothing wrong with making money, but to then say that that is somehow good artwork, or to try to sell that to someone who doesn't know as much about art, and they're relying on that gallery person's expertise,
their connections
to provide them with a good work of art, I think at that point they're doing a disservice, because now they can take, Washtub Johnny's poorly painted wash tubs and put words to it and use the marketing to sell the work instead of letting the work sell itself.
Right. And as somebody who is trained, who is trying to make a living, for them to choose somebody who obviously is unwilling to train themselves, unwilling to progress any kind of idea. So as somebody who's formally trained, who is trying to make a living and progress an idea, to see somebody then get picked up by a gallery who is refusing to push any boundary and just painting on some kitschy item, even if they want to call themselves an outsider art, what they're doing is they're pigeonholing themselves so that they can't do anything besides that. It's really frustrating to see a gallery do the complete opposite sides of a coin, where those of us in the middle, we're forever stuck in the middle.
Yeah.
They either have the ridiculously well-talented and well-deserved artists that are being represented, and then they pluck these people who are just doing this thing to make a quick buck and saying, oh no, they're primitive, they're folk artists, they're local, they're doing these cool things. Like, no, actually, they're painting on bottle caps.
Yeah.
Like, to me, all it does is just make me glad I'm not having to deal with them, that we do have the internet, and I can do it on my own. So, you don't like seeing folk art in large galleries like Chicago Institute or something like that.
Let me once again codify that.
Okay. Well, let me finish my question first. Do you then at least like seeing the small town galleries where it is local artists who might not be as highly trained or sophisticated? Can you at least appreciate that experience?
Yes, and so there's a difference between having like the Folk Art Museum of America, which I think is a good thing. I think the work in there is part of our cultural tradition. And there's a difference between putting a Grandma Moses up and saying, oh, this is, it's a snapshot in our culture. It was done by this woman who has this history and she did these things. That's totally fine. And contextualizing it in that sense, fine. But when you then take those same things, you turn around and you sell them for millions of dollars, that's when I start to think like, well, what? This is no longer about its cultural context. And ultimately, I think that's where most of the joy for folk art comes from, is that there is a strong cultural context, usually that either you connect to or you appreciate about where that's coming from. Oh, those tartans are from this clan and everybody has their own tartan. Mm-hmm. That design comes from this village and they use these colors because they're sourced them from local colors and it's different, and these are the ways that they're different. And that story and that narrative about that culture comes through in the work. With something like a Grandma Moses who's selling for $1 million, it's no longer about any of that. Now it's about owning this piece of Americana. I have the money to now own this thing. And that's where I have a problem with folk art in institutions like the Museum of Modern Art, the Met, and these kind of places, because it's not...
It's no longer about the artwork itself or the moment in time is capturing. It's right. About exclusivity, which we've always talked about having issues with.
Right. And, even... I think it's slightly different with things like a Monet or a Van Gogh. Because having those things in the museum, preserving them, and then being able to share them by having them go on exhibitions and tours, that's a good thing. And in the same sense, like, if you put a Grandma Moses in a museum of folk art or in a show that is exemplifying American artists and shows like, here are rural artists, here are more highly trained artists, and you contextualize it in that way, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing.
You just want it to be...
I want to be presented in...
you wanted it to be represented for what it is.
Yeah. That's really...
So you have a problem with them elevating it, not the fact that you can celebrate the artwork. I can't stand that blue dog. But if people like it, cool, you can celebrate it for what it is, but don't say that it's up there with the level of, like...
Rembrandt.
Yeah. Or Klimt or something like that.
Yeah.
Like, there's an obvious difference.
Yeah. And I think that's really... maybe it's a little bit elitist, maybe it's a little bit...
I think it really is. And I feel bad saying these things, and I know I'm being elitist, but at the same time, why did I pay for that education if I'm not going to nitpick and spot the differences?
And once again, this is my own personal preferences, and I have very clear preferences on the artwork that I like, the things that I want to view, and when I go to institutions, the stuff that I want to see. Folk art like that, I want it in a folk art show or a folk art museum or something like that.
Or a local... I'm okay with it even being at a local gallery.
If it's local work.
Because if the artist is local, I love seeing that. I want to see this local farmer's depiction of his backyard. Cool. Let me see your experiences on the canvas or in a sculpture or woodwork, whatever it may be.
Right. And I'm totally down with it too. But when I'm going to, the Art Institute Chicago, I don't want to see that.
Yeah.
I want to see the best of the best. I want to see the things that are Maud Lewis, yeah. Once again, I think that's part of the reason why I have such a hard time with so many folk artists, because
you can't really name them.
It's not that you can't name, it's that their work, it's only rememberable to the people who are around them, who are part of their culture, part of their community at that time. Otherwise, like, cool, she painted an unimpressive picture of washerwomen hanging up clothes. I've seen, there's hundreds of those out there. Why is hers elevated more so than someone else's? None of them are really that great. They aren't really, an amazing depiction, and you could use the same vocabulary and terminology to elevate any number of those pictures.
Right.
And that idea of, she has that thing. She just did that thing that was amazing. Like, did she, or is that something that you want to be there, and so you now have skin in the game, and that's what you're pushing?
It's the it factor that they always talk about on like Star
the
Search.
It factor
and
is
stuff.
what you can sell to someone else. That's all it is.
Yeah,
you know what it
it's
is?
a marketing tool, like we've already
marketing, said. Yeah, and that's why I said I have a problem with it, because I feel like it's the marketing now and not the work.
Yeah,
I can look at a Rembrandt. You don't need to sell me on a Rembrandt. And I can also look at his contemporaries, and if you put a Rembrandt portrait next to other portraits of the age, you can see the clear skill that elevates his above it. Same thing with a Michelangelo. If you put Michelangelo next to his contemporaries, unless it's a Raphael, chances are, I mean, you can see the difference. There's paintings where Michelangelo has done one figure out of the painting, and you can tell which one is his because it's so much better. Or, I wish I could remember his name, but there was a contemporary who was doing a painting, and Michelangelo happened to have like seen it in his studio. He was like, "Oh, you should do these changes here, and it will elevate your piece." And the artist did it, and guess what? You can tell where Michelangelo said change things because he was that good. And that level of skill, like, you can see. You don't need to be sold on it. And his contemporaries, you can see their level of skill compared to everyone else.
So this has been our pessimistic, cynical view of folk art.
Yeah, I mean, once again, our podcast is about our opinion on things and how we view stuff. And that's one of the problems of being a formally trained artist is when you look at people who are not formally trained, you nitpick.
Yeah, we do get a little... What's the word I'm looking for?
Critical?
Jaded.
Yeah.
We get a little jaded. And I hate it, but at the same time, I want to be able to spot those differences so I can elevate my own work.
Right.
And it's not that I don't believe that folk art doesn't have value. I absolutely think it has value. I think it has cultural significance. But in our society, when we hear the word value, it automatically ties in with monetary. And I don't believe monetarily it is the same as those that are at Christie's.
I mean, I don't think a lot of things at Christie's have the monetary value that they...
Yeah, that's a terrible example. But monetarily, it's just not the same as other artwork. Right.
I mean, honestly, in my opinion, the fine arts, those cultural keystones that we talk about, your Van Goghs, your Brunelleschi's, your Da Vinci's, they shouldn't be able to be bought and sold. They should simply be owned by cultural institutions and then shared. Instead of, it
should be for everyone. Art is
right.
For everyone. It should be visible to everyone.
Right. And placing dollar amounts and going to auctions. What is it? There was a great report where a Picasso sold for $96 million. And nobody clapped or applauded the Picasso. They clapped the high dollar amount.
I know what you're talking about. That was, she's a writer. Oh, I know her name. I'm going to look it up real quick. That way I can put it in the notes.
Yeah. But that perfectly encapsulates what I think of is wrong with that level of the art market. Once again, as someone who's not part of it, who will probably never be a part...
Fran Lebowitz.
Yeah.
She's the one that said that. And it's so true.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut.
No. And, someone who's not part of it, when I see that perfectly encapsulates what I think of is wrong with that kind of system, with the kind of system that the high-end art market currently has, where you have 3 main auction houses kind of dictating what is high-end fine art, what galleries are Christie's, Sotheby's.
Not only creating the value for it, so therefore making the market, but those that what's that called? It's like a panel of people that authenticate the artwork, but it's all anonymous. You don't know who's on the panel. So that lady who found a Pollock at a thrift store they kept saying, no, this isn't authentic. They had a fingerprint on the back. One of his fingers, either his thumb or his forefinger, made an imprint on the back in the wet paint. And they did CSI level investigation and proved that the paint was the same from his studio. They did scientific analysis, I don't know, under the microscope, and proved it was his, and they kept saying, no. She got an anonymous bid on the work, said, we'll pay you X amount of money. And she's like, no, I'm not going to take it, because as soon as you pay for it, then you're going to authenticate it and quadruple its value.
Right. And that's the thing. When that level of the market is pretty much controlled and run by a very select few of people, I have serious problems with that. When you look at people like, let's use Damien Hirst as an excellent example, like the YBA or YBE, British artists, whatever that group is. It's a group of people who went to the same school. They were all the same affluent white people who knew all of those high-end gallery directors. And it's like, okay, so there's like a direct line from who they were before they were artists to who they are after artists, and why they're suddenly being picked up and shown in
the Venus Biennale
or all these other places. Like, okay, how much of what they're doing is actually because it's good or noteworthy or has any kind of cultural significance beyond the fact that it's being propped up by those who are at the high dollar end of that culture? Like, what is the real worth of that kind of work if it isn't in dollars?
And to steer this back to folk art, as frustrating as that is, to see these people with elite connections these people with elite connections elevating their work solely because they know them, but then to see these same galleries go pick up Joe Blow and call him an outsider or the next great folk artist, there's always that level of cynicism and suspicion underneath, like, no, y'all are totally exploiting him.
Right. And once again, just to reiterate this is
these are our opinions.
Not just opinions, like, they aren't founded in any kind of fact. They're just what I feel and what I think about when I see these things. I don't know anybody who's part of the YBE. I actually don't know that much about that group in general. And I'm pretty sure that I read that they all had connections to Sotheby's or Saatchi's or something like that in an art magazine like 10 years ago. So even like my information on it is sketchy, and everything I've said should be taken absolutely with like 6 grains of salt. But
I do know for sure that Fran Lebowitz said that quote, though.
But when I'm talking about these things, when I look at that level of the market, when I look at folk art, my gut instinct, my initial reaction is always kind of cynical and kind of like, why? What about this? If it isn't that it's a high level of craftsmanship, if it's not that it has any kind of significant cultural significance outside of the fact that they were the one picked.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, part of it is, well, if they're being picked, why not me?
Yeah.
I'm trained. I make art. I can do bad art. Like, why aren't
you
paying me?
You want tchotchkes? Let me show you tchotchkes.
Yeah, like, why aren't you paying me?
Yeah.
$20,000 for a bad painting.
Well, it's like our friend says, I have a problem with nepotism until the nepotism benefits me.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to complain about it all day long until it's me getting the benefits of it. Then I'm 100% okay with it.
Which is terrible.
But true.
Well, I don't think we I don't think we answered what is folk art, but I think we definitely have a strong, very jaded opinion on it.
I think we identified what folk art is. Folk art is artwork that comes from a cultural tradition that isn't founded in the formal one.
It is the untrained.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we didn't ruin your day with our cynicism.
And I do want to point out, if you like folk art, if you see a piece of work that you like and like, wow, I really like that, buy it. Pick it up.
Yeah.
Make it
like
yours.
we said, there is value in it. There's
Yeah.
cultural significance. Just sadly, we live in a capitalist society.
Yeah.
So there's a monetary component to everything.
Right. Yeah, just because I don't like seeing it in certain galleries and museums doesn't mean that if I wasn't at a yard sale and somebody had painted something, I was like, oh, that's cool, I wouldn't want to put it in my house. If you like something, you should.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to add that last little bit. So even though I'm cynical about it, I still know that if I see something I like, I want to celebrate it.
Yeah. I love going to estate sales.
Yeah.
You always find good artwork.
Good tools.
Well, this has been Artsplanations, and as always, I am Joanna.
And I'm Andrew.
And hopefully you are you. Thank you for listening to our podcast. It means so much that you would take the time to listen to us. If you like what you hear and would like to help us out, please give us a review and like on your podcast app and iTunes. Comment and tell your friends and family. We would also like to thank the Joy Drops and Free Music Archive for our music.
We want to have a conversation. This means that any research we do for a subject is often done a week or two before we record, and our notes are minimal. This also means that as we talk about things, we might make mistakes, like in the pronunciation of names or the misattribution of a statement or a piece of work, and the messing up of titles and dates. If we do and we notice, we'll put a correction in the show notes. And if we don't, let us know so that we can.
The best place to contact us is on our website, www.artsplanations.com. There you can find out more about us, the show, and each episode.
You'll be able to find every artist quote and most of the specific vocabulary we use in each episode, as well as a list of upcoming topics.
We invite you to join the conversation, so please let us know what you think. If you have suggestions or topics for discussion, you can let us know at our website, www.artsplanations.com.
If you are curious about our artwork, the best place to find it is on our Instagrams. I'm at Andrew Malczewski, that's at AndrewMalczewski.
And I'm at joanna.bolsons.artist. That's JOANNA.BOLSINS.ARTIST.
These links and others can be found on the Artsplanation website. That's www.artsplanations.com. www.artsplanation.com.